Hey, I just wanted to apologize for the quality of this podcast. I'm not totally sure what happened, but maybe don't try to record a podcast on your iPhone if the iPhone is charging. I guess that's the lesson I learned here. I tried to clean it up the best I could. It's pretty bad, but sorry about that.
I read Clay's Arc by Octavia Butler. This is a reread for me, and it's part of me reading the entire Patternist series, but I'm reading it in reverse order. The the idea that I had was to read it in the publishing order and kind of assuming that that was the reverse order. But then I discovered that this book was actually the last one published. So I completely messed that up, but oh well, here we are. So I guess I'm just reading it in reverse order, the reverse chronological order of the series. So anyway, Blaze Arc, here we are. Blaze Arc is about two different stories that are kind of braided together. They get labeled in the story as past and present. They're both about men who are infected with this kind of symbiotic alien parasite life form and then try to cope with that sickness. So the first one that we're introduced to is a guy named Blake. He's a doctor. He's on a road trip with his twin daughters. One of them is sick with leukemia. And I think that we're like in the 22nd century or something like that, or the late 21st century, somewhere in a future where American society has broken down to the point where the highways are a very dangerous place for people to be, and there doesn't seem to be like law and order in government, especially in these remote places, like they're driving through the desert. And so they kind of like come from a place that's like a walled in enclave. And Blake, like I said, is a medical doctor. And so because of his professional career and status and all that stuff, it protects him in society from the kind of desperate people who live in these kind of liminal spaces between walled settlements. And so we kind of see that illustrated. Like none of this is explained up front, but like Blake comes across in ambush basically at the beginning of the story, and we see that he has a automatic rifle in the car with him, or some kind of like big gun. I don't know if it's a rifle, but some kind of like automatic weapon. And so that's like pretty surprising that he's like on a road trip and then he just expects to need a powerful weapon like this and is ready to use it. But these guys get the drop on him and he doesn't get the chance to use it. And this is how we meet the other main character of the story, Eli, who was an astronaut and the only guy who survived a return trip from the nearest star system, so like Alpha Centauri or Proxima Centauri. I'm not sure if those, maybe those are the same thing. I'm not totally sure, but like a nearby star system, and they landed on the planet, and there was life on the planet, and then they were infected with some kind of symbiotic life form that was inside all of the other life forms, and now it's inside of him, and that's the kind of primary antagonism of the story. It's not like Eli versus Blake. It's really Eli versus the symbiotic creature and Blake versus the symbiotic creature. But then they're at different stages in their journey with that and meeting each other here. So Blake, it seems like Eli is his big problem. And so Eli directs his guys to capture the two young women, which is the main thing that he's after, kind of. I guess he wants Blake too. He just needs more people for his little settlement thing that he's doing, and this is a good way to do it. And so, at first, Blake thinks that they're going to get robbed or something like that, and they're going to take their stuff. But he's not interested in that. And then he thinks they're going to get kidnapped and held for ransom. And so these things are like common side. They're common enough that Blake's trying to figure out the motivation of what's going on. And like all of that is very subtle, but is also like alarming and really colors in the world building and the degree to which like the American project is just absolutely collapsed. And so Blake and his daughters, one of the daughters has leukemia, she's sick, and they all get captured and taken to the compound that Eli has established. And then it kind of the rest of the book is switches back and forth between Eli's backstory and then back into the what it calls the present with Blake's family. And so I think it's significant that Blake is a doctor. This brings back the theme of the healer that was in the previous book, The Pattern Master, where Amber, the healer, was one of the main characters and kind of formed a triangle, I think, of important characters. And she had an alternate point of view about the trajectory of society, I think, that was kind of implied with her presence. And Blake being a healer here is important because of the biological nature of the symbiotic creature and also the way that it manifests initially as a sickness and requires multiple reinfections in order to adapt the host to the point where they won't die from the infestation. And so all of that, like his expertise kind of allows Butler to write the narrative in a way where he can kind of analyze and understand it so that that information can be transmitted to us as the readers, I guess. It's like the kind of technical, mechanical utility that having that character there does. But I think it also is important because there are always healers in these patternist books, and they play a particular role in the patternist society. So it's interesting to see them in the Clayark society. And this really gives us like a view into the Clayark society that's also really fascinating, I think, because they're depicted as monsters in Pattern Master. And we know that they can use sophisticated tools and that they can talk, but there's no sense in which they seem to actually really be people. And the just like the horror of this book is that they absolutely are people and the degree to which they're being taken over. Like this first generation of infested hosts are fundamentally different than all of the generations that are going to come after them. And I think there's something in common with Pattern Master where I talked about the kind of biological imperative or the way in which the mutant abilities that the patternists have kind of commands their biology and their behavior. It compels them to behave in certain ways or take certain actions no matter what. And in the same way, this infection that Eli brings back to Earth changes the biology of the people in fundamental ways and compels their behavior. So, for example, it changes the sense of smell, sense of taste, even vision to a certain degree. Like they can see in the dark way better. But also they have like certain expectations. They talk one part, it's really eerie, where they talk about that they keep expecting the sun to be a different color because that's the color that it is in Proxima Centauri. And so they have cravings for live animals. They want to eat like live chickens and stuff like that. They smell good to them and they taste good too. And then they have like a incredibly accelerated and powerful healing ability. And so they get pretty mangled sometimes and they're able to like regrow entire limbs or recover heinous injuries really, really quickly. But because of that, they have like a highly increased metabolism. They need to eat constantly. And so there's a kind of resource problem that Eli's running into. But the bigger problem that he has, and the reason why he kidnaps Blake and his daughters, is that there's a kind of imperative to reproduce, and especially to like reproduce the symbiotic creatures into people who are not infected yet. And so the uninfected people smell good to them in a way where they want to infect them. And they tend to like bite and scratch uninfected people without meaning to do those things. Like if they're not actively stopping themselves from doing it, the symbiotic creature will just kind of like take over and they'll do it without even being aware that they did it. And so in that way, there's this theme that Butler's exploring of bodies that are taken over by biology, or like the command that biology has over our bodies, the ways in which we are not in control of ourselves. And I think it also goes back to those themes of race that I talked about in Pattern Master, where there's the kind of racial theme of the Clayarchs are like a different kind of race. And in being a different race, their entire behavior is compulsively different than like quote unquote normal human behavior, right? So this kind of imagines like race is like a totally social construct. Like there's no biological difference in the quote unquote races. Like they're just it's just like superficial differences of skin color, hair texture, and stuff like that. There's no difference in intelligence or the distribution of anything that is like normal human attributes in what we call races. It's just a total social construct. So Butler kind of imagines what if there was difference in race. And this kind of like, I think, draws into sharp relief what makes us human and what is actually different when you have the Clayarchers. They're disturbingly alien and different in the ways that they are taken over by their bodies, in the degree to which they're able to adapt and kind of assimilate into this new way of thinking and behavior is really kind of upsetting. And there's also like a bleak heroism, especially I think to Eli's story, where he went to this other world, he got infected with this thing, and he fights it all the way back. He doesn't want to land on the earth because he knows that it's going to infect other humans, and it's going to spread and spread and spread. But he can't stop himself. Like he's compelled to go back to the earth by the symbiotic creature. And so he just does his best to mitigate its spread. And that's part of the reason why he is out here in the middle of nowhere desert and gathering just a few people to him. He's just trying to give the symbiotes the bare minimum that they need so that the compulsions calm down in him, so that they don't take over him. And that hopefully his little settlement will just die out because of the accelerated metabolism and the fact that they're in the desert and resources are scarce. And that will put a stop to the symbiotes on Earth, and they will not be able to turn into a pandemic and spread everywhere. But because we read Pattern Master before this, we already know how this turns out. And so, like I said, there's a kind of fatalism or determinism in the story that gives it a little bit of a different flavor. And I think, like I said, the whole thing is kind of tragic. And certainly, like Eli's story has that tragic hero kind of a thing where he is doing this really strong internal fight against all of his impulses, but he can't win. Like every time he makes these tiny little compromises, it just leads to unexpected and uncontrollable side effects. So, like, for example, bringing Blake into the community and slowly turning the daughters and turning Blake himself ultimately is what leads to the pandemic breaking out. Because, ironically, even though Blake is a healer and a medical doctor and he learns so much about how the symbiotes work, he's the one who goes out and infects a person who travels all over the world and is in contact with all kinds of people and is pretty much guaranteed to turn this thing into a pandemic, which we know is what happens by the time Pattern Master occurs. And so Eli turns Blake's daughter. They're twin daughters, so they're the same age, but there's the healthy one and the sick one, and he turns the healthy one, whose name I'm pretty sure is Rain. The other one, the sick one, is Kira. Pretty sure I've got that right. And he turns Rain to the Clayarker side, and he gets Blake to where he's starting to turn. And this is the part of the book where we start to experience, from the character's point of view, all of the enhancements that come, the added strength and speed and the greater sense of smell and hearing and sight and all that stuff, but also the downside, how, the cravings for raw meat and all of the monstrous kind of tendencies and whatnot. And the fight that all of the characters have to retain their humanity and their kind of sense of personal dignity, I guess, and the ways in which they compromise in those things and are assimilated by the symbiote aliens. There's a bunch of other science fiction that's kind of like this, right? Like the Andromeda strain and things like that. But those are like viruses. And this is just like a really interesting look at, that's related to the virus idea, right? Because in other stories where there's alien contact, then there's usually like some kind of like you're talking to another alien species and they're talking back, and then there's some kind of struggle for supremacy, and however that shakes out is how it shakes out. But with this, the struggle is with our own biology as human, and the kind of Cartesian struggle, right, between like, who are you really? Are you a mind that rides around in a body, or is your body essential to who you are? Is it participating in your identity in fundamental ways? This book seems to say that like your body is way more fundamental than our society is comfortable with admitting. That a lot of our society is built around the idea that you are what you think, that I think therefore I am, and that so your thoughts are the essential true soul of yourself, if you will. And that your body is just kind of like an afterthought to the whole thing. It's just like a vehicle for your mind. But this book just is basically like laying out a premise that undermines that whole thing. That the mind has an equal share of the body in producing who we are as individuals. And that all of the compulsions of the body cannot be merely subdued by like some kind of asceticism or like a mind over matter type of situation. That there's just more fundamental drives to the body that are inchoate to the psychological experience. That all of this is not just like in your head, is what I'm saying. Like your body is really an important factor in who you are. And ultimately, all of these characters, if the struggle is internal, they lose that internal struggle. At the same time, I think there's also something here about building communities, about the structure of power, and the idea of utopia. And so, like, there's, America as a project has a real utopian kind of gilding to it, I think. There's an idea of like that America is some kind of important idea of modern freedom, and Butler's picture of America in the future is of a collapsed project, a utopia that has failed, if it ever succeeded at all. And over and over again in her work are these little societies that are built up that are trying to create communities that take better care of their people and that are self-consciously trying to bring about some kind of justice for the people who are building it, or at least a haven, or maybe trying to enact some kind of change. So if you think in Pattern Master, there was the entire pattern, and Rael was failing to protect his people in the way that he was supposed to. And so his son had to come and replace him so that these attacks on the community by the Clayarchers could be more effectively fought against, and people could be protected, and all of the things the pattern is supposed to supply to its members to get back to normal and be doing the things that it's supposed to be doing. And certainly the character of the pattern and the patternist society is dystopian, with all of the slavery and exploitation and supremacy that's happening. And I think the same kind of dystopian feeling is in this book because of the way that the biology is has a supremacy over the mental aspect of people. And so the person like Eli has intentions of containing this pandemic outbreak and subduing it and smothering it in a lack of resources and just letting it kind of burn out. But that is thwarted by the fundamental biology at play. And so his mind loses to his body. The body has supremacy over the mind, which is an inversion of what we're typically taught, going all the way back, really, I would say, even to the foundations of Christianity or into Judaism in our culture. And the ideas of those religions that certainly have a utopian turn to them, especially as it relates to our bodies and their relationship to, sin and imperfection versus our souls, which are more godlike and persist after death. And so I think Butler is like subtly tapping on all of that stuff and turning it on its head, and also showing how, that there's like a bunch of children who are Clayarchers here, who are these bizarre cat-like creatures with human faces, but who seem fundamentally happy. And all of the parents of these monsters are happy to see them and like love them and have all the affection for them that they would have for, presumably human children if they didn't have this infection happening. And so for those children, this community really is a kind of utopia. They don't know anything else. And they're not having this internal struggle of all of their kind of human grooming and in culture and society pushing against these biological drives and causing them to feel disgust with themselves or shame. They just don't have any of that. And so they're going to grow up with a totally new culture and a new outlook on themselves and a different relationship with their own mind. And so, in that way, they really have created a utopia for the next generation, in a sense. But we kind of know where that's headed in the long term because of the next book and the ways in which their society will not be able to produce enough food and resources for the incredibly strong metabolism that the Clayarchers have. So eventually, Blake figures out what's going on and he tells his kid, and Rain is kind of like, yeah, Dad, I knew what was up. I'm into it, but let's get out of here anyway. We gotta protect my sick sister who has leukemia. Let's get out of here. And so they escape from the compound and try to make their way back to one of the sanctuary cities or the walled cities or whatever. But instead, they end up getting into like bandit encampments. They call them like those sewers. And this is a pretty like even more scary part of the book. And I think it speaks directly to this kind of thing that I'm talking about with utopia and dystopia. Because this whole thing seems really messed up, with the alien creatures being born and the way that they're kidnapping people and infecting them and trying to hold them at this compound and all of these like weird impulses. It's all really messed up and tense and sickening. And so escape seemed like a really good plan. But then you see the society that just regular humans have built. These aren't the patternists. These aren't, like anybody infected with anything. These are just a depiction of the future of America, according to Butler. These are Americans without the structure of society and culture and the benefit of reliable resources. And they are brutal and craven. They horrifically abuse the family when they kidnap them. They seem really depraved. They're incredibly violent. And so it's a picture of society that is incredibly pessimistic, but makes us kind of reconsider like, oh, this Playarch society is so dystopian and messed up and weird, but is it? Or is it like the beginning of maybe something better? Like maybe this whole project of America should collapse if this is what it's turned into. Like it seems incredibly terrible the way that people are living and the things that they're doing to each other out in these lawless regions. And so I guess what I'm saying is that it's even worse out there among the normal humans than it is to live in this kind of bizarre alien society where at least like Eli is kind of thinking about the welfare of the entire planet in the way that he's running his community. These people are just after some kind of depraved, sadistic pleasure that is 5 minutes in the future, and they're not thinking about anybody else or any kind of future whatsoever. And so I think at the end of the book really troubles the idea, I guess, is what I'm saying, of, what is utopia? What is dystopia? What's the better path? But is it better for everybody to turn into clay archers, or is it better, for humanity to continue if it's going to be this very Hobbesian, the way that I talked about in the last podcast, every person at war with every other person kind of situation. And so we saw the kind of control and command of the patternist society in the previous book. And now we see what the Clayarcher society is like. But all of that might be preferable to this human society that is more familiar and I think is way more scary because it feels extremely possible, as opposed to any of this other science fiction stuff. And I think it gets at the thing that Butler is really talking about. Like she's kind of revealing what's underneath all of these metaphors of alien symbiotes and psychic mutants and all of this stuff. That our society has a deep sickness to it and that we're headed in a bad direction. And we need to carefully consider the kind of future that we're choosing for our society. So, like I said at the end of the book, they try to get away from these people, and it's a pretty terrible situation. Rain ends up dying. Kira gets infected, and it seems like her leukemia is quote unquote cured by the symbiotic creatures, and she ends up getting pregnant with one of these monstrous babies. And Blake is pretty much beat to hell and dying, but manages to infect the truck driver who beat him up so badly that he's going to die. And then that truck driver, they can't manage to stop him. And he's just going to go all over the place and deal with people who do global trade. And boom, the pandemic is starting. And so Eli's attempt to protect the world from the symbiotic creatures fails. And, the world is going to become what we saw in the Patternist book, the Pattern Master book. So it's another dark vision of the future that I think that Butler is making some really striking social critique and also building like super interesting worlds to think about and playing with that societal tension, but also like these characters are incredibly heroic internally, and they have the strong moral focus, and they're fighting with their own bodies in really compelling, interesting ways that make us uncomfortable, I think, to read about because our society is so clear about how our minds rule over our bodies and that we have a firm control over the future, based on technology and our culture and our government. And she just kind of turns all of that stuff up on its head and reveals all of the ways that we don't have control, but also how, life persists no matter what. We don't want to die. We adapt. And there's something strong about that. And I don't know if it's beautiful necessarily, but it is like full of possibilities and change and difference. And so even that is like, there's a fear of a kind of erasure. I don't know. Her books always get me thinking. Anyway, we'll be moving on to the previous slash next book. So the second book in the series, Mind of My Mind, which is further back in the past, and it's a better look at how did America get into the state of being that it's in the clay art.